Well, part 1 of the Final Fantasy VII Remake has finally been released, and whilst I was never going to buy the game myself, that doesn't stop me from taking a look at the soundtrack to the game and see how the team have revamped and revitalised Nobuo Uematsu's soundtrack for the original game. It's time for another episode of Shuffle or Boogie. Around half of the pieces in the FF7 Remake soundtrack are fairly traditional, classical reimaginings of the original songs. Fully orchestrated pieces with various classical instruments weaving in and out of them and playing off each other with different counter melodies. I was expecting a few curveballs and was hoping that these would impress me. Some of them did. Let's start with the Prelude, which has the iconic harp arpeggio to start with. I always see the prelude to Final Fantasy VII and the ending theme as kind of a representation of one of the game's themes, which is nature versus science. And I think that both these themes kind of hold a feeling of sort of the awe of nature, but a really cool element that they've added to the prelude is just a tiny hint of a saw synth to back up that harp arpeggio. And like I say, this is very subtle and it fades out very quickly, but it's just a little addition that nails down that theme, I think. Other than that, this is a pretty faithful rendition of the Prelude. The only change is that it's gotten a bit more epic with more layers, and the dynamics kind of start off low and then build up, and then it does the same thing again. You've got the huge orchestral bass drum swells and brass swells and things like that, and adding two pieces in this way and making them more epic is not always a good way to go. Like, it can hamper the original vision of the piece, but in the case of the Prelude, I think they did a really good job. Next is Tifa's theme, and I think this is probably the most faithful of the tracks in terms of how close it is to, I think, what I believe is the original vision. This is very subdued, more subdued than most of the other tracks, and the only real difference is the adding of obviously more layers of woodwinds and strings. The strings kind of form a counter melody in certain places, but it doesn't take away from the main melody. I love how the woodwinds are kind of taking it in turns to form the main melody. It's all sort of flowing through, but then there's a really subtle orchestral bass drum just like forming a pulse in certain parts. It's all really subtle and really well put together. Shinra's theme, another really well put together track. This one is kind of all about the bombastic brass and that main beat that just continues throughout the entire track. I love how partway through they introduce like little clicky 16th beats in there to just keep it sort of pacey, keep the track moving. But I also think they should have focused a bit less on the brass throughout the entire track, and maybe introduce some more synthy based stuff and possibly make that 16th beat into more of a glitchy beat. I personally would say that would be more true to the original vision because, you know, it's Shinra's theme. The whole idea is that they're the most technologically advanced, company, and it's all about the technology. But overall, yeah, this track has a lot of impact without needing to overcomplicate things or add too much to it. It's a very simple track, but again, very powerful and very effective. So here's where I take a moment to say that working together with Uematsu on this project are Masashi Hamauzu and Mitsuto Suzuki. Both have done brilliant work, you know. However, I'm not a huge fan of Masashi Hamauzu, especially when it comes to arranging, because he tends to clutter things up a lot and possibly add too much when he didn't necessarily need to. And from here on, this is where I really started to feel Hamauzu's influence coming through in these tracks. And it starts with one of the worst tracks on the soundtrack, which is Scorpion Sentinel, or basically the boss theme from Final Fantasy VII. This track is quite frankly a complete mess. It felt like they were just trying to shove as much sort of bombastic rhythms and counter melodies in there, just to clutter it up as much as possible. I believe it's also slightly sped up from the original, which sometimes when the strings and that are trying to play these fast melodies, which were originally envisioned to be on the electric guitar, it just makes it sound like really weird, like the strings are playing too fast to be humanly played. Obviously that's not the case, but you know, that's how it feels. This remake track has no downtime, no time to let certain melodies breathe or certain sections and rhythms breathe, that were really quite iconic in the original. Take these two sections from the original, for example. There's a repeated phrase with some moving chords that are pretty much unresolved, like they can just go around for as long as needed, really. But then after that, it's still a section of downtime, but it resolves and then moves on to, you know, go back to the beginning, as it were. In the remake track, as I say, there's no downtime, but we also don't get that feeling of the melody or the chords resolving at the end there, especially as this weird time signature change is just shoved in where they just cut off the end of the melody. Towards the end of listening to this track, I was just kind of baffled, and it was complete sensory overload, like as if they just thought, we need to shove everything we possibly can in the ears of the listener. And in the end, it all takes away from what was good about the original track, which was the memorable melodies and a real sense of sort of movement and purpose throughout the entire piece. This track, unfortunately, does not have that, and it's a hallmark of Masashi Hamauzu, which will unfortunately continue into the next few tracks. Before that, though, we have a real pleasant surprise with a rendition of On Our Way, which I'm trying to remember in the original where it's first played, because I believe it's first played at Calm, so I'm not sure whether Calm is in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, but I'm just trying to think of where it would actually be played. Anyway, for this track, I would say this has amazing potential for adding stuff and tweaking beyond the original. Again, this is a very traditional orchestral arrangement with, you know, loads of different instruments, and it's just really subtle, but the amount of different instruments that flow in and out of the track is just amazing. You know, it's a really chilled out track. My favourite addition is a little bongo beat that comes in partway through, which just for some reason gives me the feeling of sort of being in some of the homes in Final Fantasy VII when you would be exploring places like Calm. A real intimate feeling, I would say, because it sounds very sort of close mic'd and everything's just sort of layered on there, but again, without taking away from that main catchy melody. Next up is the Turk's theme, which relies heavily on sort of surfy style guitar, which has a very laid back feel to it, which is spot on. There's this same sort of pacey 8th note tom rhythm going throughout the track, which basically keeps it moving, but it also gets a bit repetitive after a while. This is a surprisingly long track, and it doesn't really go many places other than to add subtle bits, but really underneath. My favourite bit of which is like a little marimba rhythm just going on in the very background. If you're really focusing on like what's underneath, you may pick up on these things, but it might get a little repetitive for some people because it is essentially that main guitar melody over and over again, which, let's face it, is just like 3 notes. I think what was really missing here compared to the original is, the clicks. And I think that would have added a lot more character to the piece. As it stands, this is kind of the more forgettable piece of the soundtrack, I'd say. Next is the battle theme, or Let the Battles Begin, and this almost nailed it. It almost was a perfect rendition of this piece, I would say. Each section on its own builds up within itself, and then the track as a whole kind of has these builds as it goes through. And the instrumentation really complements that, switching back and forth between like lower register and higher register stuff. I really liked how instruments would drop out and give way to other instruments. Like there's a section where you can really clearly hear I believe it was bowed double bass or possibly cello right down in there. Basically, each melody and each element of the track has its time to shine until it comes to a certain section where Masashi Hamauzu just had to add his own little counter melody. And I think in this instance, it just completely takes over the melody that we're all used to and the melody that we all want to hear. Again, this is supposed to be a moment of downtime in the track, and towards the end of the melody, it's the bit where it sort of adds a run, where it's a shifting chord pattern, which again just obfuscates the initial melody. I mean, the little run of chord changes itself is cool, yeah, but when it serves to, obfuscate something else, it makes it kind of pointless when they could have just left it how it was, really. But as I say, that is one tiny little nitpick in what is essentially just like an amazingly composed and arranged piece with all these elements that just work together with each other so well. Up next is Eris's theme, or Flowers Blooming in the Church, and I have to say this one was absolutely nailed. I love how they started off with the ostinato piano, something that was present in the original, although I don't believe it was piano, but it was kind of a delay effect of that 3 notes repeating. But to change that and sort of revamp it into a piano ostinato that pretty much goes throughout the entire track, I think worked incredibly well. Also note, Masashi Hamauzu, this is how you incorporate counter melodies into an established piece. Every single counter melody in this complements the initial melody, either that or like weaves in and out So like when one melody is dying down, another one will swell up into the piece. And pretty much all of them are done expertly and come in at just the right time to either enhance the counterpoint or just add another interesting melody that kind of fills the space a little bit. Other than that, not really much more to say on this piece. It's again another really traditional orchestral arrangement and stays pretty true to the original, but everything that it changes is this time an enhancement on the original. We have a pretty decent version of Hurry. Again, I would say the instrumentation needed possibly a little more synthy stuff, and again they use, I believe, strings, although it's hard to tell because it's really in the background for an it's kind of really fast run, and it's kind of legato strings when it needed more of an attacky sort of synthy sound, because that run is one of the most distinctive parts in the piece and it's kind of completely in the background now. Other than that though, it was kind of all about the offbeat stabs and the thumping bass just kind of making you feel as if, you know, like the track title suggests, you need to hurry. I think this track does definitely lend itself to what they've gone for here with the kind of orchestral sort of bass drum booms and you know, snare rolls and stuff like that. So yeah, this is definitely one of the better renditions on this soundtrack. The main theme is one of my favourite musical pieces of all time, and again this is a fairly faithful rendition of the main theme, and basically the instrumentation they've been using for this soundtrack, the orchestral stuff, lends itself completely to this arrangement anyway, so it really works. The way the strings swell into each part of the melody is delivered perfectly, really. The only negative I can say about this, although it may just be a complete nitpick, is I feel like they've stabilised the harmony a little bit. I feel like the original was slightly more dissonant. Although it may just be that they utilise synthetic instruments there and they have a bit of a dissonant quality to them to begin with. Maybe that's just personal preference again, so I'll leave that up to you. But we need to move on now to the final two pieces, which both baffled me completely and are pretty much just two of the worst pieces I've ever heard. And I really don't know what the hell happened. Starting off with Lay Down Some Rubber, which is of course the motorcycle theme, one of my favourite tracks from the original. And they get the beginning bit right, I guess, at least. It sounds like the motorcycle theme, it reminds you of it, but then it kind of just completely goes off on this weird tangent with like a drum solo, and the production is like completely different to the rest of the soundtrack. It sounds like a really rough recording just of like a guy playing a drum solo, and they've kind of added stuff on top of that. It reminds me again of like how the boss theme was, where whoever arranged it was just trying to maybe show off or shove a load of ideas into the track. Not to mention, near the beginning, we suddenly have a guy just going, ride, 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 which I guess maybe they thought that was cool, but I don't think it's cool at all. I think it's really lame. I think that if any sort of vocal is going to be added to a video game soundtrack, it needs to be really subtle and like either really sort of maybe epic is the word, as in like the Nier soundtrack or something like that. Or, as I say again, just really subtle and in the background. I've read interviews with Masashi Hamauzu, and he has a bit of an obsession with adding vocals to video game soundtracks. And his Final Fantasy XIII pieces with vocals are some of the most annoying that I've heard. And he has done a lot of other stuff as well with vocals that I've just found just really, really annoying. And this is kind of the worst of that, because the ride thing just seemed to be shoved in there, like, and it just didn't really match the rest of the song. It's just like a one-off thing that happens, and then it moves on to this big extended drum solo with screechy guitars that never really come to a definite idea of what's actually going on. So yeah, it just kind of sucks all the melody and all the catchiness out of the original track, and not really adding anything back in return. And finally, there's what I assume would be played in the Honeybee Inn section of the game. Stand Up is again another vocal track, and again completely different production to the rest of the soundtrack, and so insanely out of place. I was just baffled again listening to it. It's kind of like a late 80s, early 90s rave tune, I guess. I suppose that's way beyond the scope of what I'd be able to analyse in a musical sense, because it's not really my forte. But what I will say is that another thing Masashi Hamauzu has been known to do in the past is add like jazzy elements and stuff like modes, playing in modes. And there's a part near the beginning of the track where it just sounds like the singer's singing completely out of tune.
Life can be harsh, it can be bitter, but we can make it oh so sweet here at the Honeybee in every moment.
And then there's also like little shrill jazzy runs on the brass or possibly saxophones, just like screeching in your ear throughout the track. And it's all just really like, claustrophobic in production. I personally would say that this is just completely out of place in both the Final Fantasy VII universe, but also in terms of like the direction they've gone with this remake soundtrack, which is to be a lot more traditional and using classical instruments. Yet there's just this track thrown in there. But then you've also got a few tracks which obviously are more later Uematsu style, with like the electric guitars and maybe a bit more metal influence. So yeah, a bit of a mixed bag of sort of clashing genres here, I think. In conclusion, I'd say this soundtrack delivers exactly what I'm expecting from Final Fantasy VII Remake as a whole. Something where overall it's a great experience, a polished experience, perhaps some interesting, innovative ideas thrown in there, but maybe not really understanding the original vision of the source material of Final Fantasy VII. Sometimes adding things that work and work really well, and sometimes adding things needlessly that clutter up the experience, or make things a bit more of a cheese fest, or more Japanese, as I like to say sometimes. Hopefully at some point I will be getting Final Fantasy VII Remake and giving it an actual critical review, and pointing out the flaws, which I'm sure it has, because so far I haven't seen anyone point out anything wrong with the game, and I'm getting quite frustrated because it seems like none of the reviews want to actually take a critical look at it and maybe look at it objectively. They just want to fanboy over it, which is something of a problem in the Final Fantasy community to begin with. Hope you enjoyed this video anyway, as something of a different take on the game. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.